And we are back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. And joining me once again, I always look forward to our conversations, is Sonali Kolhatkar. Sonali is a senior correspondent with the Economy for All project at the Independent Media Institute. And this week, she has been thinking about and has written about unions and the lawlessness of corporations, so many corporations, in dealing with those unions. So first of all, Sonali, welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much for having me back, Richard.
It's a pleasure, as always. And let's start with this. You mentioned in your latest article, which has received several different headlines because it's syndicated. In Counterpunch, for example, it's called "Why Corporations Choose Lawlessness to Fight Unions." I think I know the answer to that, but tell us if you would.
So, when I say lawlessness, what I mean is that we have labor laws in this country, right? And you can study the history of them. They were hard fought, hard won labor laws that involve respecting the right of individuals that are working in a company or any kind of employer under any kind of employer to collectively decide to form a union and then bargain for their rights with their employer. I was in a union for many years as a journalist on Pacifica Radio, represented by initially AFTRA, which then became SAG-AFTRA. And it is a very it's a way to even the playing field. And of course, today, big corporations, big and small, but mostly the big ones, tend to look at breaking labor laws, violating labor laws as the cost of doing business. So they hire these big union busting law firms, as Apple did in its negotiations or in its dealings with workers at their stores trying to unionize, which was what I started out my story discussing. They hire these big union busting firms. Littler Mendelson was the one that Apple has hired. In fact, it was the one that Pacifica hired back in the day to fight
Yeah.
unionization for a time before there was a changeover and they thought better of it. And these law firms, I can only guess, because of course their dealings are confidential, I can only guess that it's these law firms that are giving these corporations, corporate employers like Apple, like Amazon, advice on breaking labor laws, on violating labor laws. And I say this because so far, especially under the Biden administration's National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, which is the government entity that is supposed to enforce labor laws, companies like Apple, Starbucks, and Amazon and others repeatedly break labor laws while their employees are trying to unionize. And each time they break a law, at most, they might get a fine that runs into a few thousand, maybe $100,000+. That's it. There's no one gets put in jail. There's no percentage fine based on profits. And so they see it as a cost of doing business. And unfortunately, a large percent of the time, they have such a chilling effect on employees that they win. They break the law in order to undermine unions, and often they succeed. And in such an atmosphere, it is kind of shocking and surprising when employees do actually end up choosing unions, as only a couple of Apple stores in the country so far have done.
One of those Apple stores is not all that far from me in Towson, Maryland. It's about 40 minutes away. I had to see a doctor up there once. I went in there and congratulated them on voting to put in a union. Their spirits seemed good. But since that visit, which was some time ago, and you write about this in your article this week, since then, Apple has pulled a classic, I think it's kind of a classic by now, dirty trick, which is telling employees everywhere that isn't unionized, which is most of Apple, here are some nice new perks for you, but we're not giving these to the unionized employees because they're going to have to negotiate for them. That looks an awful lot like retaliation. Is it?
Absolutely, it is. And the Starbucks tried to do the same thing with its stores when so many Starbucks cafes began unionizing. Starbucks promised perks to all employees except those in unions. And the NLRB has come down very clearly saying that this is a labor law violation. Now, all it takes is for Apple, Starbucks, Amazon, one of these big companies to fire a fire an employee who is a union leader or someone who's agitating for unionizing. They don't even have to, they certainly wouldn't admit that that's why they were firing them. And they can make up any reason that they need to. In fact, without a union, you generally don't have job security, and you can be fired um, without cause, even unless there's some handbook that outlines the rights of workers, and even then they don't stand a chance. All it has to do is fire one person to have a very chilling effect on the entire potential bargaining unit for people to say, no thanks, we don't need a union because I don't want to lose my job. And even if the company is held accountable after the fact, even if that employee has been reinstated, the damage is done. And companies routinely do this over and over and over again. They have so little to lose, and they think they have so much to gain. What blows my mind is that they will pay these union busting law firms millions of dollars. I mean, Apple has hired an army of lawyers, like 110 lawyers from Littler Mendelson, by one estimate, across the country to advise them on how to keep down unions. So they'll spend millions of dollars. They'll even spend the money on offering these perks to non-union employees, because it costs money to offer any kind of perks, which is why
Right.
often these companies don't do it, rather than decide to work with a union. I mean, it might even be more financially lucrative in the short term for them to accept and embrace the unions, but they're fighting the long game, which is that in the long term, a
Right.
unionized workforce is much more likely to be able to demand better wages and cut into corporate profits. And they don't want that.
Exactly. And what I was thinking of, first of all, when I said I think I know the answer, sort of flippantly, to why they break these laws so often, it's because they can, or they've been able to, right? They've gotten away with it. As you write in your article, the National Labor Relations Board under Biden has done more enforcement of the law than we were seeing under predecessor administrations, but still, basically, they feel whatever fines or penalties they may get hit with in the long run, the cost of the attorneys, as you said, the cost of even the perks that they're denying to union employees, pays off in the end. And what I was thinking of when I was reading your article and just now too was that famous graph of productivity gains from World War II through about 1970 and then beyond, that shows that for 25 years or so, wages and productivity gains and employer profits rose together. And then somewhere along the line, beginning in the 70s, they diverged and wages became effectively flat as profits and productivity soared, right? So I think of that space between the two lines that's opened up since the 70s and is now this enormous gulf. In a sense, reading your article, I felt that's what they're fighting over, because the difference between the 1960s and now was many more private sector workers were unionized. And I think they see this, I think they're looking at the long game, I guess is a way of putting it. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, they absolutely are looking at the long game. And it's not just about pure money. It's about power, but that power translates into money. And by that, I mean that today we see more and more employers that want to not only pay their employees less, but they want to have, they call it flexibility, flexible hours, which is a euphemism for uncertain shifts. And so employers want the flexibility to be able to have more people staffing their stores or factories when demand is high, and then sending them home when demand is low, so that they don't have to keep them working steady hours and not paying them, and they don't want to have to keep paying them when demand is not high. And so you have people who might work at Starbucks or fast food companies or Amazon warehouses who are called upon to work. They don't know when they might be, what hours they might be working next week or the week after that. They don't know. You can't plan a life around that, right? And
Right.
so a union membership allows workers to effectively bargain for steady hours, for job security. And companies don't want that. They want to be able to pick and choose and kind of move people around like pawns based on profit maximization. So it's not just pure wages, it's also having control over their hours, having job security, having that kind of like, imagine being a parent and telling your
Exactly.
kid, I don't know if I can make it to your baseball game this weekend because I don't know what my hours are going to be, or
Or
trying to
trying to
go to
get
college or something.
childcare, right? I mean,
Yes, any
how do you
childcare.
know on Tuesday if you don't know what shift you're working on Thursday? How do you know how to get somebody to watch your child so you can go to
Yeah.
work?
And so that's the kind of power that employees want to continue to have over workers. They don't want to give it up because unions mean that they have to then actually negotiate with people as people who have whole lives, who have rights, and
Right.
they just don't want that. And it's incredible because these repeat offenders, and we need to be calling them repeat offenders, they're lawless, they're corporate outlaws. They face no penalties in the long run for repeatedly violating labor laws. I mean, for the rest of us, imagine if you write a bad check back when people were writing checks and you kept writing bad checks over and over and over again. Maybe you would get away with it 10 times. Eventually, the law would catch up to you and you'd
Right.
probably be tossed into prison for continually writing bad checks. Corporations don't have to face that kind of penalty. It doesn't matter how many times they violate labor laws, they don't get penalized in the long term for repeatedly breaking labor laws. There's just a few fines, and maybe they, reinstate a few workers they fired, but the damage is done. Or maybe they, stop doing something bad that they were doing, but they don't actually have to pay a price. Imagine if we started throwing CEOs into prison for,
Exactly. Yeah.
for their third strike. You would see a sea change in union rates.
Right, absolutely. And the other thing that struck me when I was reading your piece, Sonali, was that public opinion uh, should be a bigger factor here. I mean, I think, okay, in that, as you point out, I think now public approval of unions is, I think you say 71%.
71%.
I know
Amazing.
it's much higher than it's been in decades, and yet, and I'm not criticizing the public. It's up to those of us who organize and educate to lead this, or spark it off. But uh, Apple, for example, when it was abusing and mistreating workers in its Chinese factories, there was enormous public disapproval, political pushback. It was forced to retrench somewhat on that, at least make some effort toward improving the working conditions in these Foxconn subcontractor
I remember
factories and
that.
so on
Yeah.
in China. And yet, you'd think with this massive approval of unions, and I've seen it myself, it's just in people you converse with going about your day, right? If it comes up, uh, you would think that there should be a way to get people, if not to formally boycott, which I guess might be illegal, I don't know, but uh, to really hammer Apple and Starbucks and other repeat offenders in the marketplace, in the court of public
Yeah.
opinion, as a way of amending their ways. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how
Yeah.
that might happen or if it could happen.
Actually, it is happening with Starbucks. So if you see Starbucks' latest, I believe it was their last quarter earnings, they posted were quite grim. The report that they posted was quite grim. And one of the factors that they attribute their loss in profits or lowered profits was to a boycott that Starbucks workers have been
Ah,
calling for unionized Starbucks workers. I didn't get to add that in my story because, I have to keep it narrow, 1,200 words every week. But it's quite remarkable that the Starbucks worker movement, which is very visible, has had some impact. And, it's always really interesting when iconic American companies see unionization efforts, right? When Starbucks is known all over the country. It is on every street corner, practically in every city in the US. And when its workers started unionizing and the union drives started becoming successful like wildfire across the country, it just got a lot of attention. And that had an impact. And these workers, many of them very young workers, by the way, young, diverse, highly educated workers who know their labor history and who are very savvy in social media marketing and getting attention that way, have spread the word. And so they do actually call for boycotts. Now, Apple workers have not formally called for boycotts because boycotts, we have to be very clear, boycotts have to be well organized, and there has to be a proper call from stakeholders for boycotts. So I don't believe Apple workers have called for a boycott yet. But another reason why there isn't a move or greater sort of outrage over corporate tactics against unionization, so there's this big disconnect, huge levels of approval of union, and yet very low levels of actual unionization. Now,
Exactly.
attempts to unionize are on the rise, but the actual numbers of people in unions are still extremely tiny. And that disconnect is because most Americans are not aware of how easy it is for corporations to continually break labor laws, not pay any actual real price for that, or be penalized in any way that matters, and then keep having these chilling effects. So the workers trying to organize know very clearly how hard it is, but the rest of the public, I think, is just not aware of the fact that corporate outlaws are allowed to continue to break the laws, and it's okay. We need to change the laws. Yes, boycotts, it's important, but if we need to strengthen labor laws. We have these labor laws on the books, but unless there's some actual heft behind them, it's not going to matter. So that's definitely something that needs to happen.
And new laws, like the Employee Free Choice Act, the FCA,
Yes.
that was being discussed and got no real traction during the Obama years. Uh, we need to push our lawmakers to pass laws that are even stronger in protecting unions, right?
Absolutely. And, I really, for anybody who's out there considering unionizing their workplace or involved in union efforts, stay strong, because in the end, it is worth it. That's the other thing that we also need to remind ourselves. The effect of being in a union there's studies have shown, many studies have shown a very strong correlation between unionized companies and higher wages. And what's also remarkable is that whole industries benefit when even a portion of workers in that industry unionize, because it puts an upward pressure on wages. Auto workers who are unionized demand higher wages, and then the companies that have non-union employees feel pressure to offer their employees higher wages to compete, to attract workers. And so unionization helps union and non-union workers, and it's been proven over and over again that it leads to lowered corporate profits, which is why corporations are so angry about it and fight so hard against them, and increased wages. It is a zero-sum game. There is no both and when it comes to corporate profits and higher wages. Higher wages means lowered corporate profits. That's why they fight against it. And we have to embrace that idea. Corporations can share some of their wealth with the rest of us. They don't need to hoard it all. You can't have record high corporate profits and high wages. You've got to have higher wages at the expense of lowered corporate profits. And that should be okay, because that's good for society.
And it's such an important topic. I hope you stay on it, and we'll try to stay on it on our end too. Again, Sonali Kolhatkar, senior correspondent with the Economy for All project at the Independent Media Institute. As always, thanks for your reporting, and as always, thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you, Richard. It's my pleasure.
We depend on your support here at the Zero Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much.